6 months had passed since Danny Cole had arrived at the Valtteri Galactic Academy. 6 months of training with May Santos. 6 months of learning to contain and direct his emotional responses. 6 months of understanding what it meant to be human among the stars. He stood now in the entrance of the Grand Hall, the largest lecture space on campus. Hundreds of students filled the rising seats, representing species from across the Confederacy. Floating cameras recorded the event for broadcast to dozens of worlds. This was not an ordinary history lesson. Today, the Academy would teach the burning of Keleth Prime. Danny had studied this event during his training. 1,500 years ago, the Nethori civilization had conquered a peaceful world called Keleth Prime. The inhabitants had been a gentle species devoted to art and philosophy. They had no weapons and no military. They had welcomed the Nethori as visitors. The Nethori had interpreted their gentleness as weakness. Over 3 days, Nethori forces had systematically killed every living being on Keleth Prime. They had burned libraries filled with 10,000 years of cultural achievement. They had destroyed temples that held the spiritual history of an entire people. When they finished, nothing remained but ash and silence. The Nethori had never been held accountable for this crime. They had become powerful members of the Confederacy, and their official position was that the burning of Keleth Prime had been a necessary action against a potential threat. No Nethori leader had ever apologized. No reparations had ever been paid. Until today, Danny felt Lena's hand on his shoulder. She had been his constant companion through the training months, guiding him when his control wavered. She asked if he was ready. Danny said he was not sure. This was different from practice sessions in small rooms. The entire galaxy would be watching. If he lost control, the consequences could be catastrophic. May appeared beside them. She reminded Danny that he had been trained for this moment. His grandfather had spent his life arguing that humans belonged in galactic society. Now Danny had a chance to prove it. They entered the Grand Hall together. The crowd fell silent as Danny walked to a seat in the exact center of the room. Every eye in the hall was focused on him. He could feel the empathic sensitivity of hundreds of minds, all waiting to see what would happen. Administrator Yeth stood at the podium and addressed the assembly. The administrator explained that today's lesson was controversial. A delegation from the Nethori government had formally objected to the topic being taught. They had argued that the burning of Keleth Prime should remain a private matter for their species. Danny saw the Nethori delegation seated in a special section near the front. There were perhaps 20 of them. Tall beings with scales that shifted color with their emotions. Currently, their scales were dark with suppressed anger. They did not want this lesson to proceed. Administrator Yeth continued. The Academy had decided that historical truth could not be suppressed simply because it was uncomfortable. The lesson would proceed. However, in recognition of the unique circumstances, a human student had volunteered to demonstrate controlled emotional response. All eyes turned to Danny. He took a deep breath and remembered his training. Professor Thalara stepped forward to deliver the lesson. The ancient Valtteri's silver skin glowed softly in the hall's lights. Thalara began speaking in a measured voice, describing the history of Keleth Prime before the Nethori arrived. Holographic images appeared above the stage. Danny saw peaceful cities surrounded by gardens. He saw artists creating works of stunning beauty. He saw children learning from their elders in outdoor schools. He saw a civilization that had chosen knowledge over power and compassion over conquest. Then the lesson moved to the arrival of the Nethori fleet. Danny watched as the images showed the first attacks. He saw buildings burning and people running through streets filled with smoke. He heard the screams of those who had never known violence suddenly surrounded by death. He saw parents trying to protect children who would not survive the day. The familiar pressure began building in his chest. He felt the horror and the grief rising like a tide. But this time, he did not try to suppress it. Instead, he guided it, shaping it with the techniques May had taught him. The students around him began to react. Some pressed hands to their hearts. Others closed their eyes. But they were not overwhelmed. They were experiencing Danny's emotional broadcast, but it was focused and clear rather than chaotic and destructive. Danny let them feel the tragedy of what had been lost. He let them understand the beauty that had been destroyed. He let them grieve for a people who had offered welcome and received annihilation in return. But he did not stop there. He had learned that human emotional broadcasts could carry more than grief and rage. They could carry hope. Danny thought about the descendants of the Kelith people who still survived on distant worlds. He thought about the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for 15 centuries. He thought about a future where such crimes would never happen again. He let these feelings flow outward alongside the grief, loss and hope, sorrow and determination, memory and purpose. When he finally let the broadcast fade, the hall was silent. Several students had tears on their faces. Others sat with expressions of profound thought. The lesson had ended, but something had changed in the room. A young Nethori stood up from the delegation section. The scales on the young being's face shifted through colors that Danny could not interpret. The Nethori walked slowly toward the center of the hall, toward Danny. Every guard in the room tensed. But Danny did not move. He waited. The young Nethori stopped in front of Danny and spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. The Nethori said that until today, the burning of Keleth Prime had been just words in a history file, a fact to be acknowledged, but not felt. Today, the young Nethori had finally understood what the ancestors had done. The young Nethori had felt it as if the victims were family, as if the crime had been committed against loved ones. The young Nethori thanked Danny. Then the young being knelt. A gesture of profound respect in Nethori culture. Other Nethori from the delegation stood. One by one, they approached. One by one, they offered gestures of acknowledgement and grief. These were not officials or diplomats. They were young people who had finally been allowed to feel the weight of history that their elders had denied. Danny helped the first young Nethori rise. He said that feeling the past was the first step toward healing it. What happened next was up to them. Administrator Yeth ended the lesson and dismissed the assembly. As students filed out of the grand hall, many paused to look at Danny with expressions of wonder and respect. Garmeth gave him a nod that carried centuries of gratitude. Professor Thelara smiled with ancient knowing. Later that evening, the Academy released an announcement. Human students would no longer be restricted in history classes. Instead, they would be offered training as historical witnesses. Their emotional responses recognized as a valuable tool for confronting the past. Danny called his grandfather that night. The connection crossed light years in an instant, and his grandfather's face appeared on the screen. Oren Cole was old now, his hair white, and his face lined with decades of diplomatic service. Danny told him everything that had happened. When he finished, his grandfather was silent for a long moment. Then Oren Cole said that he had spent his entire career arguing that humans had something to offer the galaxy. Today, Danny had proven that argument beyond any doubt. Oren said that he was proud of his grandson. Danny smiled. He looked out his window at the purple sky and the floating towers of the Academy. He thought about the young Nethori who had knelt before him. He thought about Garmeth and the Crethani finding freedom from their past. He thought about Captain Nina Walsh, who had accidentally shown the galaxy what humans could do. Humans were not just students or soldiers or diplomats. They were witnesses to history, carrying the weight of the past so that others could finally face it. Danny was proud to be human. Danny found Lena in the garden behind the history building. She was sitting on a bench surrounded by flowers that glowed softly in the morning light. She did not seem surprised when he approached. He sat beside her and told her about his meeting with Professor Thelara. He told her about Captain Nina Walsh and the incident of 2847. He told her about the 12 students who had fallen into catatonic states and the 3 instructors who had been permanently damaged. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said that every human at the academy learned this story eventually. It was the foundation of everything they were taught about controlling their emotional responses. Danny asked if there was a way to stop broadcasting emotions entirely. Lena shook her head. She said that human emotional broadcasting was not something that could be turned off. It was wired into the fundamental structure of human consciousness. The best they could do was learn to contain and direct it. She asked if Danny had read all the files that Professor Thellara had given him. Danny admitted he had not finished. Lena smiled and told him to keep reading. The story did not end with Captain Walsh. Danny spent the next several hours in his dormitory room, reading through the data chip. The files documented events that had occurred after the incident of 2847, and they painted a picture that Danny had not expected. The Galactic Confederacy had initially wanted to ban humans from all educational institutions, but a small group of diplomats had argued against this decision. They had pointed out that human emotional broadcasts carried more than just intensity. They carried meaning. When Captain Walsh had experienced the horror of the Metheny purges, every mind around her had felt something specific. They had not just felt generic sadness or anger. They had felt the wrongness of what had been done. They had felt an absolute conviction that such things should never be allowed to happen again. In the months following the incident, several species had begun internal debates about their own historical crimes. Officials who had dismissed past atrocities as unfortunate but necessary had suddenly found themselves unable to maintain that position. Something had changed inside them. They had felt, through Captain Walsh's broadcast, what it meant to be a victim of such cruelty. Danny read account after account of changed policies and reformed laws. Species that had oppressed others for centuries had suddenly reversed course. Reparations had been paid. Apologies had been issued. Historical wrongs had been acknowledged and addressed, all because a human had felt strongly enough to make others feel it too. A message arrived on Danny's device. It was from Ambassador Siltek, a Velthari diplomat who was visiting the academy. The ambassador requested a meeting. Danny found Ambassador Siltek in a private conference room near the administration building. The diplomat was old even by Velthari standards, with silver skin that had faded to near white. Siltek moved slowly but spoke with clarity and purpose. The ambassador said that Danny's grandfather had been a remarkable man. Danny's surprise must have shown on his face because Siltek smiled gently. The ambassador explained that Headmaster Orancole, Danny's grandfather on his mother's side, had been instrumental in negotiating humans' continued presence in galactic society. After the incident of 2847, when many species had wanted to isolate humanity, Orancole had traveled from world to world, making the case for human inclusion. Danny had known that his grandfather had been a diplomat. He had not known that his grandfather had been famous across the galaxy. Siltek said that Orancole had understood something that most humans did not. Human emotions were not a curse or a danger. They were a gift that the galaxy desperately needed. Danny asked what the ambassador meant. Siltek explained that most species in the galaxy had grown comfortable with their historical crimes. They acknowledged that terrible things had happened in the past, but they felt no urgency to address those wrongs. Time had dulled their emotional responses. Ancient atrocities were simply facts to be recorded, not wounds to be healed. Humans were different. Humans felt the weight of history as if it were happening in the present. When a human learned about an injustice from 1,000 years ago, they reacted as if it had occurred yesterday. This intensity of response was overwhelming to other species, but it was also transformative. When empathic beings experienced human emotional broadcasts, they could not remain detached from historical events. They felt what the victims had felt. They understood, on a level deeper than logic, why such things were wrong. And they felt compelled to ensure that such things never happened again. The ambassador said that human emotions had become the conscience of the galaxy. Wherever humans went, the past could no longer be ignored. Danny left the meeting and walked across campus in a daze. He found May Santos in the training facility near the dormitories. May was another human student, a few years older than Danny, with calm eyes and a steady presence. Lena had mentioned her as someone who had mastered the art of emotional control. May agreed to demonstrate. She asked Danny to sit across from her and open his empathic sensitivity as much as possible. Danny had never consciously done this before, but May guided him through the process. Then May picked up a tablet and began reading about a historical injustice. It was a minor incident compared to the Metheny purges, a case of political prisoners being mistreated during a conflict a few centuries ago. May read silently, and Danny watched her face remain calm and composed. Then he felt it. A wave of emotion reached him, not overwhelming but deliberate and focused. He felt sorrow for those who had suffered. He felt anger at those who had caused the suffering. But more than anything, he felt a clear and unmistakable message. This was wrong, and it must never happen again. May set down the tablet and smiled at Danny's expression. She said that with training, human emotional broadcasts could be controlled and directed. Instead of overwhelming everyone nearby with raw intensity, a trained human could send specific messages. They could make others understand exactly what they needed to understand. Danny asked how long it took to learn this skill. May said it had taken her 3 years of daily practice. But she had started without any guidance. With proper training, Danny could learn much faster. Garmith appeared at the entrance of the training facility. The massive Crethany had been watching them. He approached and told Danny something that changed everything. Garmith said that his people had committed terrible crimes centuries ago. They had enslaved several weaker species and worked millions of beings to death in their minds. For generations, the Crethany had refused to acknowledge this history. They had considered it shameful to discuss. Then Crethany diplomats had attended a conference where a human was present. During a discussion of historical trade agreements, the human had learned about the Crethany slave era. The emotional broadcast that followed had been felt by everyone in the room. For the first time, the Crethany had truly understood what their ancestors had done. They had felt the suffering they had caused, as if they had caused it themselves. The experience had been devastating, but also cleansing. The Crethany had finally been able to face their past and begin healing. Garmith said that his people owed a debt to humanity. Human emotions had freed the Crethany from centuries of denial. Danny looked at May and Garmith. He thought about his grandfather and Ambassador Siltek. He thought about the files he had read and the lessons he had learned. Human emotions were not something to suppress. They were something to master and use for good. The galaxy needed what humans could give. Danny asked May when they could begin training. He had decided to embrace his humanity rather than fear it. Professor Thalara's private study was filled with artifacts from across the galaxy. Ancient weapons hung on walls beside diplomatic treaties. Holographic images of historical figures rotated slowly on shelves. The Valkyrie professor sat behind a desk made from wood that had grown on a world now destroyed by war. Danny sat across from the professor and waited. Talara studied him with silver eyes that had witnessed centuries of galactic history. The professor asked if Danny knew about the incident of 2847. Danny said he had found references to it in the library, but could not access the full records. Talara nodded slowly. The professor said that what Danny was about to learn was classified at the highest levels of the Confederacy. But Talara believed Danny deserved to understand why humans were treated differently at the academy. The lights dimmed and a holographic recording began to play. Danny saw the same academy campus, but older in design. The purple sky was the same. The white towers were the same. But the students walking across the grounds wore different styles of clothing. And the technology visible in the image was clearly from an earlier era. Thalara explained that 200 years ago, the Galactic Confederacy had made first contact with humanity. Earth was a small world on the edge of explored space, and humans were a young species just beginning to reach beyond their home system. The Confederacy had decided to extend an invitation to Earth, and part of that invitation included an exchange program. The image focused on a human woman in a military uniform. She had brown hair cut short and a confident posture that suggested authority. Her name was Captain Mina Walsh, and she had been selected as the first human to attend the Velthary Galactic Academy. Danny leaned forward. He was looking at the first human to sit where he now sat, to walk the paths he now walked. Thalara continued the story. Captain Walsh had arrived with great fanfare. She was intelligent and disciplined and eager to learn. For the first few weeks, everything went well. She made friends among the alien students. She impressed her instructors with her dedication. The Confederacy believed that humanity would integrate smoothly into galactic civilization. Then came the day of the history lesson. The recording shifted to show a lecture hall similar to the one Danny had sat in that morning. Captain Walsh sat among alien students, paying attention as the instructor presented the day's topic. The lesson was about the methane purges. Danny asked what the methane purges were. Thalara's silver skin seemed to grow darker. The professor explained that 8,000 years ago, the methane people had ruled a vast empire. When several subject species had attempted rebellion, the methane response had been absolute. They had sterilized 17 inhabited worlds. Entire biospheres had been burned away. 40 billion sentient beings had died screaming as their skies turned to fire. The recording showed Captain Walsh watching holographic images of the destruction. At first, she seemed composed, taking notes like the other students. Then the lesson moved to specific accounts. A mother trying to shield her children as the atmosphere ignited. An elder watching his entire culture burn. A child alone in the wreckage, calling for parents who would never answer. Captain Walsh's expression changed. Her face went rigid. Her hands gripped her desk until her knuckles turned white. The students nearest to her began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The recording showed what happened next. Captain Walsh did not move from her seat. She did not speak or shout or make any threatening gesture. She simply sat there, and the air around her seemed to become heavy. Students began pressing hands to their heads. Some stumbled from their seats and tried to reach the exits. An instructor collapsed. Within minutes, the lecture hall had become chaos. Students were screaming and crying. Some had fallen unconscious. The holographic images of the methane purges continued to play as bodies lay scattered across the floor. Captain Walsh sat motionless at the center of it all. Tears ran down her face, but she seemed unaware of anything around her. She was lost in her own emotional response, and that response was broadcasting at full strength to every empathic mind in range. The recording ended. Danny sat in silence, trying to process what he had seen. Thalara explained the aftermath. 12 students had entered catatonic states and required weeks of medical treatment. 3 instructors had suffered permanent psychological damage and could never teach again. Captain Walsh herself had been unharmed physically, but when she finally emerged from her emotional state, she had been devastated by what she had caused. Danny asked why it had happened. Why had Captain Walsh's emotions affected everyone so strongly? The professor stood and walked to a shelf, where a human artifact rested. a simple photograph of Earth from space. Thalara said that the Confederacy had spent decades studying human psychology after the incident. They had discovered something remarkable and terrifying about the human species, that when humans learned about atrocities, they did not simply acknowledge that terrible things had happened. Their minds recreated the experience emotionally. They felt the fear of the victims. They felt the grief of the survivors. They felt the rage against those who had caused the suffering. For a few moments, the historical event became real to them in a way that other species could not comprehend. Most species in the galaxy had some empathic sensitivity. They could detect emotions in others and sometimes experience faint echoes of feelings. This made them vulnerable to human emotional broadcasts. When Captain Walsh had felt the full horror of the Metheny purges, every empathic mind around her had experienced that horror at human intensity. It had been like drowning in an ocean of grief and rage. Danny looked at his own hands. He thought about what he had felt during the morning lecture. He had been horrified by the Solari-Tovan War, but Lena had helped him contain it. Without her guidance, would he have done what Captain Walsh had done? He asked the professor why humans were allowed at the academy at all if they were so dangerous. Thalara turned and smiled. It was a strange smile, filled with knowledge that Danny could not yet understand. The professor said that the Confederacy had debated that question for many years. Some had argued that humans should be isolated from galactic society. Others had pointed out that the same emotional intensity that made humans dangerous also made them valuable. Danny asked what that meant. Thalara said he would learn in time. The professor handed Danny a small data chip and told him it contained records of what had happened. After the incident of 2847, the information would help Danny understand his place in the galaxy. Danny left the study with more questions than before. But now he understood why alien students feared him. He understood why he needed a watcher in history class. He understood that the emotions he had always taken for granted were something extraordinary and potentially devastating. He spent the night reading the files on the data chip. They contained records of changed laws and reform policies. They contained accounts of species confronting past crimes after exposure to human emotional broadcasts. They contained evidence that human feelings had power beyond anything Danny had imagined. By morning, Danny began to understand that his emotions were not a weakness to be controlled. They were a gift that needed to be mastered. Danny woke early and found a message waiting on his personal device. It informed him that his companion for history class would meet him outside the lecture hall at 900 hours. The message was signed by someone named Lena Park. He ate breakfast alone in the dining hall. Other students sat at tables around him, but the nearest ones were always at least 3 seats away. Danny had stopped trying to understand their behavior. He focused on the strange but surprisingly good food and thought about what instructor Kethvos had said the night before, when humans felt strongly enough. Every mind around them felt it too. Danny did not consider himself special. He was just a young man from Earth who had worked hard to earn this opportunity. He felt emotions like anyone else. He got angry sometimes. He felt sad sometimes. He did not understand how that could frighten an entire galaxy. He arrived at the history building early and found a young woman waiting outside the lecture hall. She had black hair tied back in a simple style and wore the same academy uniform as Danny. She was human. Lena Park introduced herself with a firm handshake. She explained that she was a graduate student who had been at the academy for 3 years. Her job today was to accompany Danny during the lecture and help him if anything happened. Danny asked what might happen. Lena smiled in a way that was not quite reassuring. She said Danny would understand soon. She told him to stay calm no matter what he saw or heard during the lesson. If he felt strong emotions rising, he should focus on her voice. She would help him through it. Danny wanted more explanation, but students were entering the lecture hall. Lena took his arm gently and guided him inside. The hall was large with seats arranged in rising rows around a central stage. Holographic projectors hung from the ceiling. About 50 students were already seated, representing at least a dozen different species. When Danny entered, conversation stopped. Eyes and other sensory organs turned toward him. The silence was heavy with something Danny could not name. Lena led him to seats in the middle of the hall. She positioned herself between Danny and the nearest alien students. Danny noticed that the seats immediately around them remained empty, even as the hall filled up. Professor Thelara entered the stage. The professor was a Velthari, ancient and dignified, with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly. Thelara welcomed the class and announced that today's lesson would cover the Solari War that had occurred 3,000 years ago. The lights dimmed and holographic images appeared above the stage. Danny saw star systems and fleet movements. He saw alien cities and political leaders. The professor's voice narrated the causes of the conflict, explaining how two great civilizations had disagreed over territory and resources. Danny listened with interest. This was exactly what he had come to the academy to learn. The history of the galaxy was vast and complex, and he wanted to understand all of it. Then the lesson moved to the consequences of the war. The images changed. Danny saw ruined cities. He saw refugee columns stretching across barren landscapes. He saw mass graves being filled. The professor explained that the Solari War had killed 4 billion civilians. Most had died from starvation and disease after their worlds were blockaded. Children had watched their parents die. Parents had watched their children die. Entire cultures had been erased from existence. Danny felt something building inside him. It started as discomfort in his chest and grew into a pressure that pushed against his ribs. His hands gripped the armrests of his seat. The images kept coming. Suffering upon suffering. Cruelty upon cruelty. 3,000 years of distance did nothing to lessen the horror of what he was seeing. He became aware that the students around him were reacting strangely. Some pressed themselves against the far sides of their seats. Others had their eyes closed and their hands pressed to their heads. A Torvani student 3 rows ahead was trembling visibly. Lena's hand closed over his. Her voice was calm and steady in his ear. She told him to breathe slowly. She told him to focus on her words. She told him to imagine a wall around his feelings, solid and strong, keeping everything contained. Danny tried to follow her instructions. The pressure in his chest did not disappear, but it stopped growing. The trembling students began to relax. The lesson continued. By the time the lecture ended, Danny was exhausted. He felt like he had run a marathon while carrying weights. Lena kept hold of his hand as students hurried out of the hall, many of them casting frightened glances back at him. Danny asked what had happened to him. Lena explained as they walked across campus. She called it the Watcher Protocol. Every human at the academy had to be accompanied by another human or a trained specialist during any lesson involving galactic history. Humans processed historical information differently than other species. When humans learned about atrocities and injustices, they did not simply file the information away. They felt it. Danny said everyone felt sad about terrible things. That was normal. Lena shook her head. She said human emotional responses operated on a frequency that other species could detect. Most aliens in the Confederacy had some level of empathic ability. When a human felt strong emotions, those emotions broadcast outward like radio signals. The more intense the emotion, the stronger the broadcast. Danny stopped walking. He asked if he had hurt anyone in the lecture hall. Lena said he had not caused any permanent harm. But for a few minutes, every empathic being in that room had felt exactly what Danny was feeling. They had experienced his horror and anger and grief as if it were their own. For species not equipped to handle human emotional intensity, the experience was overwhelming. A massive figure approached them. Danny recognized Garmith, a Crethany student he had seen in the dining hall. The Crethany were large beings with thick gray hide and small dark eyes. Garmith stopped in front of Danny and studied him for a long moment. The Crethany said he had been in the lecture hall. He said he had felt what Danny felt. He said it was the most terrifying experience of his life. But then Garmith did something unexpected. He extended one massive hand in the human gesture of greeting that he must have researched. Garmith said that his people had always dismissed human emotions as weakness. Today he had learned differently. What lived inside humans was not weakness. It was something else entirely. Something powerful. Danny shook the offered hand and did not know what to say. That evening, Danny received a message from Professor Thalara. The ancient Velthari requested a private meeting. The professor wrote that it was time for Danny to learn the full truth about humans and history. Danny read the message twice. He thought about the fear in instructor Kethvos's eyes. He thought about the trembling students in the lecture hall. He thought about Garmith calling his emotions powerful rather than weak. He sent his acceptance and prepared himself for answers he was not sure he wanted to know. Danny Cole stepped off the transport shuttle and took his first breath of alien air. The Velthari Galactic Academy stretched before him like a dream made real. Towers of white stone reached toward a purple sky, and walkways floated between buildings without any visible support. Thousands of students moved across the campus, and not one of them was human. He was the first exchange student from Earth to attend this prestigious institution. The honor had come with celebration back home, with news reporters and proud handshakes from officials. His mother had cried at the spaceport. His father had told him to make humanity proud. Danny had promised he would. A small floating drone approached him and spoke in a pleasant mechanical voice. It told him to follow and led him toward the main administrative building. Danny walked through crowds of alien students who stopped their conversations to stare at him. He saw tall blue-skinned beings with 4 eyes. He saw insectoid creatures with clicking mandibles. He saw floating entities made of what looked like living light. All of them watched him pass with expressions he could not read. Danny told himself this was normal. Humans were still new to the galactic community. Of course, they would be curious about him. He smiled at a group of students who quickly looked away and hurried in the opposite direction. His smile faded slightly, but he kept walking. The administrative building was enormous inside. The drone led him through corridors, decorated with art from 100 different worlds, until they reached a large office. Behind a curved desk sat Administrator Yeth, an elderly being from the Methany species. Yeth had gray skin that seemed to shift like smoke and eyes that were completely black. When Yeth spoke, the voice was gentle and welcoming. Administrator Yeth told Danny that the Academy was honored to have him. Yeth explained the basic rules of the institution and described the facilities available to students. Danny listened carefully and nodded at the right moments. Then Yeth mentioned something that made Danny pause. Yeth said that Danny would have a companion during certain classes. This was standard procedure for human students, Yeth explained. Danny asked what kind of classes required a companion. Yeth's smoky skin rippled slightly, and the administrator said it was primarily history classes. For everyone's safety, Danny wanted to ask more questions, but Yeth had already moved on to discussing dormitory assignments. The conversation ended with warm wishes for a successful academic year, and Danny found himself back in the corridor with more questions than answers. The drone led him to his dormitory room. It was comfortable and modern, with a sleeping area designed to accommodate various species. His roommate was already there. Ziri was a Torvani, an insectoid being about Danny's height with a hard shell that shimmered green and gold. Ziri had large compound eyes and spoke through a translator device attached to the shell. Ziri greeted Danny politely, but seemed nervous. Danny unpacked his belongings and tried to make conversation. He asked about classes and food and social activities. Ziri answered briefly and kept glancing at Danny with those multifaceted eyes. Finally, Danny asked directly. He wanted to know why everyone seemed afraid of him. He asked what the rule about history classes meant. Ziri's shell color shifted to a darker shade. The Tovani explained that humans were never left alone in history class. It was a rule that had existed for 200 years. When Danny asked why, Ziri said it was not something to discuss casually. The Tovani suggested Danny should simply follow the rules and not ask questions. Danny did not like that answer. He thanked Ziri and said he was going to explore the campus. Ziri seemed relieved to see him go. The academy was beautiful in the evening light. Danny walked past gardens filled with plants from distant worlds. He saw students gathered in groups, laughing and talking in languages his translator turned into words he could understand. Several times he tried to join conversations, but the groups always found reasons to disperse when he approached. He found the history building and looked at the schedule posted outside. His name appeared on the class roster with a red symbol next to it. No other name had that symbol. Danny felt frustration building inside him. He had come here to learn and grow and represent humanity. Instead, he was being treated like something dangerous. He decided to find answers himself. The academy library was open all night, and Danny discovered that much of the archive was accessible to students. But when he searched for information about humans and history classes, he found nothing. The records were restricted. Danny was not easily discouraged. He had grown up in a family of engineers and problem solvers. If the front door was locked, he would find another way in. He spent hours exploring the library system. He learned how the archives were organized and discovered that restricted files were stored in a separate section. Access required special permission. Danny did not have permission, but he noticed that the security protocols were designed for alien students. They did not account for human persistence. By midnight, he had found a small gap in the system. It was not enough to access the full restricted files, but he found references to something called the Incident of 2847. There were mentions of psychological trauma and empathic damage. There were warnings about human emotional responses and their effects on telepathic species. Danny sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. He did not understand what he was reading, but he understood enough to know that something had happened. Something involving a human student in a history class. Something so serious that it had shaped academy policy for 2 centuries. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find instructor Kethvos standing there. The Relaxian professor was tall and blue-skinned with 4 eyes that all focused on Danny. Kethvos asked what Danny was doing in the library so late. Danny decided to be direct. He said he was trying to understand why humans needed companions in history class. He asked what happened in 2847. Kethvos was silent for a long moment. The professor's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. Then Kethvos said that some knowledge came with responsibility. The professor said Danny would learn the truth when he was ready. Until then, Kethvos advised Danny to trust the wisdom of those who had seen what humans could do. Danny asked what that meant. What could humans do that was so terrible? Kethvos leaned closer, and Danny saw something in those alien eyes that might have been fear. The professor said humans did not realize the power they carried inside them. When humans learned about suffering, they did not simply understand it. They felt it. And when humans felt strongly enough, every mind around them felt it too. The professor straightened and walked away without another word. Danny sat alone in the silent library, surrounded by the collected knowledge of 1,000 civilizations, and wondered what kind of power lived inside him that even aliens feared to name. He would find out soon enough. His first history class was tomorrow morning.